Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to part 3 of our webinar series on making progress in asset management, and welcome back to those who have also attended our previous sessions. So this series is brought to you by AMO in partnership with Asset Management Ontario. My name is Erin Orr. I am a program advisor in infrastructure asset management at AMO on the CCBF team. In the first session, I provided a brief summary of the Canada Community Building Fund and our role in supporting municipal asset management progress. I also provided an overview of asset management compliance in Ontario. The recording and slides for the first two sessions are available at buildingcommunities.ca and amontario.ca. So as mentioned, this is our third session of the webinar series. The first session was on proposed levels of service and performance. The second was on risk, and today's session is on lifecycle management and financial strategy. Our last session is next week, and it is our growth panel. So this four-part series is focused on supporting the continued progress in asset management within the context of Ontario regulatory requirements. Our main objective with this series is to enable municipalities to advance their asset management programs for effective infrastructure management and long-term financial planning. With that, I am happy to send it over to Jennifer Court from Asset Management Ontario, who will be introducing today's session and panelists.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Court, Executive Director of Asset Management Ontario. And as Erin said, this is session 3 of our 4-part series. And today we're talking lifecycle management and financial strategies. We have 3 great speakers for you today who I will introduce in just a moment. But first, just a couple of administrative details. So we will have time for a Q&A at the end of the session after all of the presentations. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. We'll be using that to guide that Q&A session. Many of you are doing this already. Please feel free to introduce yourselves to the other attendees in the chat, interact there during the session. We will be sharing the presentations from today as well as a recording of the session. Those will be available on our event page. I have posted the link in the chat, and I will do so again at the end of the session. So with that said, I'm happy to introduce our first presenters. Mayuri Bakata, Senior Advisor with AM Ontario, and Dan Wilson, CIO of Centre Wellington and AM Ontario's Treasurer. So first of all, Mayuri is a manager in corporate asset management at the region of Peel. Mayuri is a chartered certified financial professional and holds a certificate and diploma with distinction in asset management through the Institute of Asset Management. Mayuri also holds the position of an accounting manager for Asset Management Ontario, wears a lot of hats. Very happy to have her back here with us today. You may have seen her last week as well at the risk session. And following Mayuri, we'll have a presentation from Dan Wilson. So as I said, Dan is the Chief Administrative Officer for the Township of Centre Wellington. He has extensive experience in the areas of municipal government and public administration with a focus on governance, policy development, organizational structure, municipal finance, budgeting, and asset management planning. In a prior consultation role, Dan assisted many municipalities with the preparation of asset management policies, strategies, and plans. He specialized in preparing financial strategies, including life cycle funding, analysis of funding sources, the calculation of funding gaps, and defining levels of service requirements. In his roles at Centre Wellington, Managing Director of Corporate Services and Treasurer, and now CAO, he's refined tools and approaches to counsel and public communication and developed strategies to assess asset management progress while promoting continuous improvement. Dan also wears a few different hats here. So as I said, Dan is on AM Ontario's Board of Directors, serving as Treasurer, and is here wearing his AM Ontario hat today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Mayuri.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Let me share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you again, Jennifer, for that kind introduction. I appreciate that warm welcome. I am excited to be here again with all of you. And this time I'll be talking about lifecycle management to prepare us for July 1st compliance to OREG 58817. I think we've seen this slide a couple of times already. The only thing that I would emphasize here on this slide this time is that I will be talking about lifecycle management strategy. So what the province wants us to do is the asset management plans must detail how assets will be maintained, rehabbed, and replaced to sustain those proposed service levels. Dan will then talk about the financial strategy for service sustainability. So basically, our AMPs should outline how asset needs will be funded while meeting our service targets over the long term. So reiterating this slide again, the asset management strategy is a combination of levels of service, risk management, life cycle strategies, and the cost to drive those decisions and develop our asset management plans. Decisions guided by the constant push and pull of these factors result in the maximization of the asset value in providing services. Lifecycle management is basically the affordable management of assets over the life cycles. It's a combination of asset life cycle strategies as well as the financial strategies. So life cycle strategies, it's basically those optimal capital and operating activities to restore the asset's condition and maximize life so that community services can be delivered at levels that the public desires. Stages of the life cycle, as we all know, starts from planning, construction, maintenance, restoration, and disposal. On the other hand, financial strategies consider the best options to affordably I'm sorry, I'm having some issues here on Teams. Sorry. Okay. Financial strategies basically considers those best options to affordably fund the life cycle expenditures with sustainable levels of revenue and debt without those undue risks to the organization. So technically, life cycle and financial strategies are continually adjusted according to the changing service requirements, risk, as well as affordability. Assets, as we all know, are the backbone of our infrastructure and services, whether it's roads, water systems, or buildings, and how we manage them determines their performance, long life, and costs over time. Proactive life cycle management leads to a number of outcomes, as you can see in my slide here, that are key to asset management and the municipality's service objectives. As I will explain in my next few slides, effective life cycle management is the only way that a municipality can affordably deliver desired services at acceptable levels of risk in a manner that is transparent to the public as well as the council. Now let's look at the link between lifecycle management as well as the levels of service. So lifecycle management strategies are informed by those proposed levels of service and the desired service outcomes. Lifecycle management seeks a balance between desired community and technical levels of service, cost, as well as performance over time. An example is doing road maintenance impacts safety, ride quality, as well as congestion. Water infrastructure impacts pressure, quality, and reliability. As part of the lifecycle management, changes to asset and service risks are continuously evaluated. Lifecycle strategies within the lifecycle management process allow municipalities to identify current as well as emerging risk and to make decisions on how to mitigate those risks. Risk-based decisions, on the other hand, can include making those prioritized decisions on assets to repair or replace, actions to mitigate risks such as repairing or replacing an asset or increasing maintenance and monitoring activities, accepting the risk of an asset failure but putting operating procedures in place in the event the asset does fail. All of these risk-based decisions in turn will inform the cost in the municipality's financial strategy and the 10-year capital plan. This diagram illustrates how assets lifecycle management starts with understanding the asset lifecycle activities and strategies to meet those proposed levels of service and how they drive the asset's whole lifecycle costs. It is from here that the municipalities can begin to assess how to sustainably afford the assets over time without creating undue risk to the organization's service objectives. Finally, having the asset lifecycle strategies, risk management strategies, and the whole lifecycle costing, the final outcome of the effective lifecycle management is an affordable and defensible 10-year capital plan and long-term financial strategy. An affordable plan does not necessarily mean that all of the municipalities' proposed levels of service and risks are addressed. This is basically what we call the infrastructure funding gap, but the municipality has a plan on how it can best manage its available resources and has a sound basis upon which to advocate for additional funding. So a key takeaway is basically that lifecycle management is the strategic process of managing an asset from creation to retirement while balancing cost, sustainable services, and risk. It ensures that resources are used effectively, services remain reliable, and risks are maintained at an acceptable level throughout the life cycle. It ties directly to the levels of service, risk and financial strategy, complies with ORIC 58817, and we all know proactive planning ensures long-term sustainability. This slide shows the Asset Management Ontario's financial model that helps municipalities track and plan for the full cost of their infrastructure and facilities. It calculates both capital and operating expenditures for each asset type and forecasts the funding needed over the asset's life cycle. This results in a long-term financial plan that projects required expenditures for the next 10 years and beyond. Before I end my presentation, I do want to mention this, that last year's webinar series has more details on the levels of service, risk, lifecycle management, and financial strategy. So I would highly recommend everybody to please look at last year's webinar series as well. This series was more catered towards the July 1st deadline to meet the compliance, but last year's has a little bit more detail on each one of these webinar subjects. And with that, I would like to say thank you to all of you for your time and attention, and I will hand that back to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Mayuri. Very, very concise and informative. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So now we will hand it over to Dan to talk about financial strategies.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. Just confirm if that's up okay, and then we'll go ahead.
Looks good.
We're good, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Happy to be here today. It's been a while since I've been able to talk asset management with a group of people, so pretty excited to do that. My presentation is going to focus on the financial strategy. To start, I have a few brief slides on the regulation requirements and just focusing in on that is directly affecting the financial strategy. So as all of you know, in Ontario, I see we have a lot of people here from outside of the province, so welcome. But in Ontario, for July 1st, 2025, we are now required to have a financial strategy going out at least a 10-year period for that. In that financial strategy, we have to identify the annual funding projected to be available to undertake the life cycle activities. And that is what Mayuri was talking about, the life cycle management strategy side of things. And you'll see there's a lot of integration and overlap between the life cycle management side of things and the financial side of things. Number two, options examined by the municipality to maximize funding projected to be available. Number three, if there is a shortfall, and I'm guessing most of us have shortfalls, life cycle activities will be undertaken, and how the risks will be managed from the life cycle activities not undertaken. And we'll get into that a little bit later in my presentation. From a growth perspective, under 25,000 population and over 25,000 population have different requirements, and it's all based on the most recent StatsCan census data. So under 25,000, you basically have to have a discussion of how the future changes in population and economic activity inform your strategy or strategies. And we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. Over 25,000 population, estimated cost to achieve the proposed levels of service, given the demand that has increased from population and employment growth. Also funding by source that will be made available because of that growth. And an overview of the risks, which is directly tied to the life cycle management strategy. And then finally, listing any key assumptions. Before I move on to the details of the financial strategy, some of the other items that are in the regulation, update the plan, including the financial strategy every 5 years at a minimum. You need endorsement by the executive lead and your council, and you're going to be reviewing progress annually with council. And we'll talk about that in a minute. There's a lot of things you can look at from a financial strategy perspective that will help in that progress discussion with council. So now looking at the financial strategy and how that relates into the asset management planning process itself. First, I want to point out how integrated this whole process is. And I mentioned the integration with the lifecycle management strategy, but it really is a flow of information that is used to develop the strategy. And when I say strategy, it's both lifecycle management and financial strategies. And then once you're happy with that strategy or strategies, you're generating a report that has to be generated a minimum every 5 years. So this is what I'm calling the asset management process, where the asset management plan is more of an output of that process. So you obviously only get good strategies if you have good information coming into those strategies, the data, the levels of service analysis, the risk assumptions that you've put in place. And some municipalities may have systems or processes that can help you automatically use that data to generate strategies, and some municipalities don't have that availability. So either way, whether you're using Excel or if you're using a system, I can show you some approaches here on how to look at this from a high level and generate what you need from a regulation standpoint. So how does this fit into preparing an asset management plan? So levels of service is what you're setting based on the data that you have available to you, and that can be a complicated process that we're not really getting into today. You use those level of service assumptions to determine a life cycle management strategy or strategies. Once you have those, it's closely connected to and integrated to calculating the financial strategies, which is point 3 on this diagram. You then have to assess whether those financial strategies and lifecycle management strategies are reasonable, both from a risk and affordability perspective. And if they're not, you go through the cycle again. You may have to adjust levels of service, adjust your lifecycle management strategy, adjust your financial strategy, and keep going through that circle until you have something that's reasonable. Like the goal here is to have options and scenarios that you're presenting to your council that have a possibility of being accepted as a long-term solution. So once you have that, you can go ahead and use that information to prepare the asset management plan. So it can be a very cyclical discussion until you have something that you're very happy with. So looking at the financial strategy itself, I like to look at it from 3 different sources of funding, and then you can get into details within each source. External sources of funding, internal sources of funding, and debt on top of that. The reason I like to get into this is obviously there's a level of risk associated with both debt and external sources of funding. With the external sources of funding, there's a risk that those sources of funding will not be available to you in the future. If you look at development charges, there's a lot of talk right now in the province of Ontario about how development charges may be impeding development, and we don't know how secure they are at this point. Grants, some of you may have fluctuating CCBF funding. You may have fluctuating other grants that are going on right now. So again, you don't know what's going to go on with those external sources of funding. So there's a certain level of risk there that you can assess within your asset management plan. Obviously, there's risks with internal sources of funding, but they're more secure. If you can get a property tax increase or a user fee increase, or if you have reserves available to you, those are more secure than the external sources of funding. So Mayuri was looking at the calculation of the funding gap. This is how you would determine that. You may determine what I'm calling optimal funding is the funding required to fund your lifecycle management strategy. And you can look at that from an annual perspective or a cumulative perspective over a forecast period. That can be funded through internal sources of funding, external sources of funding, and then you'll more likely have a funding gap at the end of that calculation. So that's where you have to look at, do you increase revenue sources? That could be taxation, user fees, etc. Do you take on debt? And what's your ability to take on debt, given debt capacity calculations? Do you reduce your levels of service and try to reduce the overall lifecycle management costs? Or do you accept a certain degree of risk and defer some of those costs out into the future? So those are all considerations you have to make when you're deciding how to manage your funding gap going forward. Something that's very useful is to track your funding sources by type, and this is to determine what funding sources you have to fund the various lifecycle costs that will be available to you. So your acquisition, operating, maintenance, rehabilitation, replacement, expansion costs, but also the multiple strategies that you may have to develop in your municipality. If you have water, wastewater fees, for example, you typically treat those as separate financial strategies, separate lifecycle management strategies from the tax supported side of things. So it can get very complicated in that you have funding sources for different lifecycle costs and you have funding sources for different strategies. So it helps in the outset to determine what goes where, and it may be very helpful for you to develop policies to help you direct those funds to where they should be spent. So here's some of the tools and tips and templates that you can use, and like I said, you may have a financial system or an asset management system that can do some of this for you, but it can be done through Excel tools and tips as well. Some of the funding sources you'll need to consider through this. The first is reserves and reserve funds. Very helpful to have continuity schedules for these reserves and reserve funds. That'll help you assess how much of these reserves you can use on an annual basis for asset management planning. You can maintain minimum balances in the reserves if you have to, or if you want to. You can assess the trending of reserve balances over a forecast period. And these are all things you can lay out in a reserve fund policy. How are those reserves going to be funded? And how are they going to be used over your asset management forecast? It is easier to have less reserves than more. You get more flexibility in how those reserves are used. If you, for example, have a tax-supported asset management reserve, which funds all of your tax-supported assets, rather than having a separate one for roads, bridges, parks, recreation, fire, and so forth. So there are pros and cons to each way, but you do get less restrictions in terms of use of the reserves if you have more generic high-level reserves in your plan. When it comes to grant forecast, it's important to quantify your secured versus potentially unsecured grants within the forecast period. Secured grants, there's a level of uncertainty to that as well, because you have, for example, the CCBF funding and the OSIF funding, you only have a defined period in the agreement for those fundings. So what do you do beyond that agreement? Do you assume status quo for the rest of your forecast? Do you assume some type of inflationary increase? Those are part of the assumptions you'll have to quantify in your asset management plan. And just be cautious of using unsecured grant funding in your life cycle or in your financial strategy, because there's a certain degree of risk of not funding life cycle costs if those grants don't come to fruition. Debt forecast is another one that is important for financial strategy purposes. For this, again, a good policy is very helpful. Where are you using debt? Where are you not using debt within your municipality? Are you calculating your estimated debt capacity over the forecast period? As you're suggesting debt, what is that doing in terms of impacts to the operating side of your life cycle management strategy? So just keep in mind that debt is an important tool, and I think through the asset management planning process, it's a good way to inform residents and council that debt isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a very useful tool if it's used correctly. And just keep in mind, if you have multiple strategies that you're doing as part of your asset management plan, such as taxation, water, wastewater, you may have to do multiple debt forecasts for each different strategy, but you'll have to combine them at the end of the day to do the overall calculation of debt capacity. In terms of growth, just very quickly on growth, I know our next session next week will deal with growth in more detail, and I'll be part of that panel, and hopefully you can join us for that. But like I said earlier, it's different based on whether you're a municipality under 25,000 or over 25,000. And I think this is one of the mechanisms we have to show the province that funding such as development charges is very important to our organizations. And they're a very much needed funding source to fund the growth related component of our asset management plan. So if you have a development charge background study, a lot of the information you may need to fill out this part of the asset management plan may be in your background study, such as the growth forecast, the growth related rehabilitation or expansion costs that go into your asset management plan. You may not have the operation and maintenance side of things, but that'll be something you'll have to flush out separately as part of your asset management plan. Municipalities over 25,000. The key piece here is to identify the cost to achieve your proposed levels of service and your funding by source. So funding by source, you're looking at, because of growth, how much are your development charges going to be? How much tax assessment growth are you bringing in? How many new users are you bringing into your water wastewater system? So with that, a lot of things to consider when it comes to growth. Just quickly on the funding gap, very important metric to put in your asset management plan and a very important metric to use as part of your annual review with council. There are many different ways to show funding gap, whether it's through numbers and percentages or through different types of charts and graphs. But something you need to look at, we talked about how to calculate it earlier in one of my slides. Very important to pick a way that both staff, council, and residents understand when you're presenting this. And then finally, scenario modeling, an important piece to this. You need scenarios to identify the best path forward for your organization. It's important to have scenarios that don't show you that you make sure you're showing progress. Don't show reverse progress or moving backwards in this. If you take inflation into account, it's very important to show a scenario that you can minimize that funding gap over time, even taking into account inflation. That's it for me. Thank you, everybody, and I will turn the floor back over to Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Dan. Very detailed, lots to think about, and great teaser for our panel discussion next week. So appreciate that. So next up, we have Cassandra Pacey. Cassandra is a chartered professional accountant, a certified general accountant, and the manager of asset management at the City of Waterloo. Before joining the city in 2003, Cassandra worked for 10 years in a wide range of industries, including retail, distribution, and automotive. Prior to becoming the manager of asset management, Cassandra was a financial analyst at the City of Waterloo and worked with all divisions within the city. A key accomplishment was the development and approval of City of Waterloo's first long-term financial plan. Her depth and breadth of experience have enabled Cassandra in her current role to successfully strengthen connections between city divisions as it relates to asset management, with a strong focus on finance, engineering, and climate action. These connections have created the foundation to embed asset management as part of city operations and ultimately to raise awareness of the importance of asset management for city staff, senior leadership, elected officials, and the public. Using strategic skills and experience developed during her time leading the city's asset management team, Cassandra has raised the profile of infrastructure management at the City of Waterloo. And so Cassandra is going to share some of those experiences with us today, talking about funding allocation. So Cassandra, with that, I will hand it over to you. Your slides are up and they look great.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to try and build off of some of the information that Dan just presented, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the City of Waterloo has done. And if I can get my screen to work. Okay, so some of the message I'm going to share is talk about some of our historical background, because one of the messages that we use at the city is that progress, not perfection, and our progress started in 2008, and we'll see where that went. I'm going to talk about how we use our asset management data to actually allocate our capital funding, whether it is our reserves or whether it's a CCBF. Talk about those funding increases and what they've done. I'll skip over the lifecycle management because you've heard a lot about it already, and then next steps. So from a historical background, the City of Waterloo took an estimated funding gap for roads and facilities to council in 2008. However, it wasn't actually supported by data, so council bounced us back pretty quickly, and quite rightly. But so they told us to come back when we had a data supported infrastructure gap number. But at the same time, they supported our idea of creating a reserve fund, as Dan mentioned, that is specific for rehabilitation and replacement activities, although they did limit it at that time to roads and facilities. Fast forward to 2016, we finally had the data because the Building Together Guide really prompted us. But we've had our first data-driven and comprehensive asset management plan that we had council approved. And then because now all of a sudden we had the infrastructure funding gap and we knew what we needed to do, we then needed to be able to identify how we're going to fund that infrastructure funding gap and those life cycle costs. So one of the pieces that we did that Dan talked about is we reduced the number of reserves that we had, and we consolidate them into what we call the CURF reserve, so our Capital Infrastructure Reinvestment Reserve Fund, and we expanded the use of it to all tax-based funded capital rehab and replacement activities. So we got that approved in 2018, and now we had this plan. We had an asset management plan, we had our long-term financial plan, and then how do we use that going forward into the future? So starting in 2019, we used our asset management system to be able to help allocate the capital rehab and replacement funding based on a percentage of needs approach, which I'll explain in a moment. And because we had all those pieces, then in our 2020 to 2022, 23, and 24 to 26 budget process, council was very supportive and approved $4.1 million in additional infrastructure funding for our capital rehab and replacement reserves. And I say additional infrastructure because we're not allowed to call it a levy, but that's essentially what it is. So for the percentage of needs, as I mentioned a moment ago, we've been doing this since 2019, And we use our asset management system, our decision support system, to optimally allocate our capital infrastructure reinvestment reserve, as well as the Canada Community Building Fund for tax-based assets. And just to build on that, the percentage of needs are based on what we call a target scenario, or the proposed levels of service, that if we had unlimited funding, what would funding levels would each asset class need? So we've used this particular pie chart to explain it to council. But in this scenario, if we had $1 million and that's all we needed, what we do, and we only had 3 asset classes, and asset class 1 needed $250,000, asset class 2, $300,000, and asset class $450,000, that converts into percentages of 25, 30, and 45%. And this is as if we had unlimited money, can do everything that we possibly need to do to maintain that proposed level of service. The reality is that we don't have unlimited funding. And in this particular case, we said that the limited number of funding we had was $300,000. So if you take those percentages of 25, 45, and 30 and apply it, that means asset class 1, while it needs $250,000, they're only getting $75,000. And on average, we only, unfortunately, have enough money to give about 40 cents on the dollar to our asset classes. And what that means is that we need to rely on our subject matter experts to professionally manage what assets can or cannot wait to be rehabilitated or replaced. And just for additional clarity, our decision support system includes condition, performance, risk, the levels of service. So we're building on all of that to be able to allocate our money. So what does that mean from a council perspective, and how have things changed? So since 2016, council has increased not only through the additional funding that I mentioned a moment ago, but through other tax increases and increasing for inflation. They've increased our capital rehabilitation and funding by $9.7 million annually since 2016, which is pretty significant for our tax-based assets. And then they've also increased the enterprise assets, so your water, our wastewater, our stormwater, and our cemeteries by another $5 million. And that indicates council's commitment to increasing infrastructure rehabilitation and addressing our asset management needs and our life cycle needs. So, as I noted a moment ago, since 2016, council's approved that additional $9.7 million for the tax base and $5 million for enterprise. And through the percentage of needs, capital funding has been proactively allocated to the assets that need to be rehabilitated or replaced. Before we started using asset management data to optimally allocate that funding, we used a 5-year average based on what asset classes had previously received. That resulted in some asset classes being a have department and some being a have not, which was kind of challenging for some areas. Our new approach of using asset management data to optimally allocate the dollars, which includes, as I mentioned a moment ago, the consideration of condition, performance, risk, and factors to levels of service that the community is receiving from those assets. And by using this, we've actually seen some of our asset classes, as you'll note in the screen, receiving up to 225% funding increase annually since over this time frame between 2016 to 2024. That's pretty significant. And we know that this approach is not perfect. We're seeing some changes. We're always reviewing and doing it, and we'll continue to seek improvements to our data and our processes. So some of what we're dealing with on the asset management side is we're looking for figuring out how to bringing in the condition more effectively, because some areas don't have the condition data, so we have to go out and get that rather than estimated life, because in our world, we're trying to say that condition trumps estimated service life. And then we're also working to improving our programming in our decision support system for projecting the asset performance so that it's more presenting what is being faced in reality. So as our internal expertise continues, we're just working with our subject matter experts. We have a very collaborative process, and we're making some changes as we go. And then that's all I have. So.
Caught me by surprise there, Cassandra. Excellent. Thank you so much. Appreciate you providing that overview of the methodology and showing, the progress that you've made. So with that, we're going to take questions for all of our presenters today. I was just going to say, oh, we haven't had any come in. We have had one. It's the usual. Will the presentations be shared? Should we expect an email, or will it be posted on AMO or AMO Ontario's website? Going to cover this anyway. So we'll start here while folks are pulling their thoughts together and submitting some additional questions. So yes, all the presentations are going to be shared, as well as the recording that will be made available through AM Ontario's event page, same page that you went to register for this session. And I believe that's linked on the CCBF page as well, or the Building Communities page. Erin can confirm that for us. All right.
Jennifer, maybe we do want to mention about the last year's webinar series as well, just so people know, okay?
For sure, yes. And so I posted this in the chat. Mayuri mentioned the last year webinar series. So in 2024, we also partnered with AMO to do a webinar series around 2024 compliance and some of the tools and toolkits that we've developed together. So those recordings are available on the 2024 webinar page. I put that link in the chat. So we dig into detail around how to use the AM Ontario Excel-based toolkits and how that relates to some of these same topics. So if you're interested in those resources, you can find them there, along with some tip sheets about how to engage in some other resources. Okay, so we have had a few questions come in now. I am just going to defer to Erin for one moment. You can tell folks where to find those resources on the AMO side as well.
Yeah, they're available on the buildingcommunities.ca page as well. And those will be shared in the slides when they're handed out.
Perfect. All right. So a question from Talia Jones. Does anyone publish specific life cycle modeling in their asset management plans? Does anyone want to speak to that?
I can start if that helps.
Certainly, Dan.
I know I did the financial discussion, but I can talk life cycle too. What I typically try to do is stay a little bit more high level in the asset management plan itself. You don't want to confuse the reader with a ton of detailed calculations and modeling. So obviously that stuff's happening behind the scenes, but it's what's important in the asset management plan is to clearly identify your option or scenario you're trying to model, and then what the end result is. And you don't really have to show how you receive the end conclusion in the plan itself. That's more for you to understand in the back end.
And maybe I can say something as well. It's similar to what Dan has mentioned. It is high level for us as well for our enterprise asset management plan. We don't mention the details, but we do have our life cycle strategy mentioned in our enterprise asset management plan, and how we actually do or develop those life cycles. That is mentioned very high level, but no, we don't give the details.
And similar, City of Waterloo doesn't give the details, but we do identify the different maintenance, rehabilitation, replacement activities, so that if you looked at sidewalks, you would know what counts as each, so get to give that perspective. And we keep it that high level, because if we're trying to get the public interested, getting into detailed models it won't go very well from our perspective.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to go to another question from the Q&A. I've started saying names, and now I'm very nervous about pronunciation, so I'm sorry in advance. Benjamin Kozwarski asks, Cassandra, what staff members were involved in determining the projects to pursue the infinite budget scenario? Are these the people that should be involved in any life cycle activity discussion?
So when we developed our decision support system, because it's a custom system, back in 2016, we had 50+ staff were involved, and they were all the way from QP up to our corporate management team. And so there was a really broad range, and we don't necessarily do projects per se. We actually get into the details of the individual pieces, because we say, well, a boiler might last 25 years and a sidewalk might last 50 years. We get into more of that detail. So to answer are these the people involved? Yes, they are. We don't necessarily go to the QP level or operational staff level as much, but they are getting more and more involved because they're very excited to talk to us. But we keep it at the staff level and talk about it all the time. We have quarterly meetings with everybody, with all the different asset classes individually to talk about what's happening in their worlds.
Excellent. Thank you. Glad that folks are so excited to talk to you about asset management. We have another question for you, Cassandra, from Robert Grimwood. For allocating funding, did you consider alternative approaches to needs-based? If so, what did you consider and what were your conclusions? Alternatively, can you tell us a little bit more about the pros and cons of the approach that you're using?
Sure. We didn't really consider any other needs-based approach because our corporate management team and our council really wanted data-based decision-making processes. So by using the information, our decision support system is based all on data, but it's all the background information that feeds into it. So I can't say we really did that because what we were doing before wasn't working. For example, facilities and parks played a heavy price in that being the have-not departments. Now their increased funding is like 225%. So they're seeing a lot of benefit from this. The pros and the cons, probably the biggest con we're seeing is that we give it to the asset classes and then we let them go away and professionally manage what projects they do spend the money on. And we're finding that the one department that has our fire department in it, they're deciding that the fire department's really a emergency service, so they should have priority. And so facilities and parks are getting, while they've gotten increased funding, they're also subsidizing the fire area. So we're actually looking forward to how do we address that so that's more of a corporate funding for fire versus the needs, because a fire truck has to be replaced when a fire truck has to be replaced because we don't want to endanger the community. So we're looking at improving that process. But the pros has really been that they're getting more money than they used to be. We've seen it gone from 30 cents on the dollar to 40 cents on the dollar. And that sounds really horrible to say it that way, but we're seeing a lot of progress and change that way.
Excellent. Thanks, Cassandra. Okay, we've got, I think a bit more of a general question from Leanne Brannigan. Have you thought about how you'll update the financials and show progress between asset management plans as required by the regulation? So again, maybe Cassandra, you want to start, but Dan, I see you've unmuted as well, so.
Sure, so.
You next.
I'll take a stab at it and then maybe Dan can chime in. So the asset management team is in the finance area, so we're always talking. And so I'm actually one of the co-authors going forward of the long-term financial plan. So when we work through the plan and we translate it over to the asset management plan, we're so interlinked our long-term financial plan was based on our asset management plan and how do we make sure we feed that in. So it's kind of almost a semi-smooth process. It has its hiccups, but semi-smooth.
Thanks, Cassandra. Dan,
I was just going to say, what I usually recommend is make sure the asset management plan has very clear recommendations, and use the annual update to council on progress to outline your progress on those recommendations. And the one that councils tend to focus on is how you're doing on the funding gap, and that can be something you focus on very visually. Are we making progress on our funding gap or not? But that doesn't have to be the sole focus. It can be on other aspects of continuous improvement on the overall planning process itself.
Excellent. Thank you both. Okay, we do have a question that came in through the chat. I'm going to answer it anyway, even though I'm going to ask it anyway, even though you didn't use the Q&A box. So Alan Selby asks, as pressures increase to devote more resources to operating costs, how can you best argue against reducing capital infrastructure support as a way to free up funding for operations?
I can try and answer this one. So one of the things that we've done is that when we ask council for additional money, we try to target for 1 to 1.5% in each year for the last few years. And what we've done is said it's not just for the the capital rehab and replacement, it's also to identify some of the staffing needs or the operating costs to accommodate that needs, because you can't build a whole bunch of new assets and then not maintain it, or even have the people to implement those projects, whether it's growth or whether it's rehabilitation projects. So generally about a half a percent of our additional funding goes towards staffing, and it could be finance, it could be asset management, IT, project managers, procurement, because we can't do all the work without all the support staff. So that's kind of where we've landed.
Thanks, Cassandra. Dan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, from Kareem Mustafa, are you looking into how to do cross asset class fund allocation in the constrained scenario? So I think we're looking at Cassandra again here. For example, one asset class has more needs, dollar value, but these needs are at a relatively lower risk.
We are definitely looking at it. We've had some troubles getting our system to spit out some of the information. We do have a separate tool that's based on the asset management plan to do a constrained scenario on our linear assets such as roads and the 3 underground pipes, so that we can develop the prioritized needs based on all of them being a weighted average together. But we are looking into it, and it's not going very fast, unfortunately. So if anybody has any suggestions, I'd love to hear from you.
Excellent, thank you. From Jay Lindsay, can you comment on how GIS data is leveraged for asset management? Are there any joins between GIS and finance databases that are used in the decision-making process?
So I can take that one unless Dan wants to. For the city of Waterloo, we use GIS as one of our single source of truth for our asset management system. So there's not a specific join to the PeopleSoft, which is our GL database, but it's a link to our system that then informs the financial strategies and financial allocations of money.
For Center Wellington, GIS and asset management are in the same division, so they work hand in hand with each other, that group. And GIS is really the keeper of the data that informs the whole asset management plan, and then results in the financing strategy. So there are very significant linkages between GIS and asset management planning in our municipality.
Excellent, thank you both. And another question from Shruti Patil. What are the change management initiatives for developing ideal financial strategy? Also, how do we align financial strategy used in asset management to inform the city budgeting process? So a couple of different but very good questions embedded in there. Please feel free to tackle either portion of that, either the sort of change management or connection between the financial strategy and budgeting.
So maybe I'll start
Sorry,
with
go
the
ahead.
change management one. We did a lot of education from like 2013, 2014, when we started talking about having a financial funding gap. And then when we took the 2016 plan, it was a very long process to walk council through, because we had like at 1.50 reserves, and we took them way down to like 25 or 30 of them because we consolidated so much of them. But it was conversations. It was conversations with staff, with corporate management, with council, to tell them why there's benefit to having a financial strategy to address the infrastructure funding gap, because we weren't going to be able to do this one time. We said for a while that it took us a really long time to get here. It's going to take us a really long time to get out of it. We've stopped using that, but it helped council understand that this isn't something we're asking them to solve immediately. We're not asking for 100% tax increase to deal with it, that we were going to be asking for a little bit at a time. But that's how we kind of managed it from our perspective. I don't know, Dan, what you did.
Actually, I was going to tackle the second question, which is aligning financial strategy in asset management with the budget process. That's people refer to operationalizing an asset management plan. That's obviously on the operational side, but it's also on the financial side and linking the strategy to the budget. And just heads up, Asset Management Ontario is working on a workshop on this very issue that will be disclosed very soon. So stay tuned for that. But it's a very rewarding experience to be able to link your budget to your asset management plan. It can start with the recommendations to increase funding in asset management and have that transition into the budget process, but it could also help you prioritize costs and projects from a risk management perspective. If you can identify what your key goals or risks are within your infrastructure, that can be prioritized within your budget process. And talking about asset management planning while you're budgeting so that you can correlate the two when you're talking to council and different members of the public. So if you can get to the point where asset management and budgeting are sort of talked about in the same manner, then you've operationalized it, which is great news.
Excellent. Thank you both. So I think we're going to wrap up there. We've answered almost all the questions, so thank you. So thank you very much to Dan and Cassandra, Miuri as well, who had some technical difficulties and has left us. Really appreciate you all being here today, and thank you as well to all of our attendees. Our final session is next week. And we are, as Erin mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be doing something slightly different. We've got a panel discussion focused on growth. If you're not already registered, you can do so from that same event page. I'm going to post it for you one more time in the chat. And the presentations, the recording will be there as well. And as Dan teased for us, we do have a very relevant workshop in the works. So if you're not already a subscriber to Asset Management Ontario's newsletter, scroll down to the bottom of our homepage and sign up. We'll be making an announcement about that shortly. So talking about that idea of budgeting and operationalizing. So final thank you to everyone today, and I hope to see you all at our final session, same time next week.